Thanks so much for coming out. I saw the big snow pile. I'm glad you didn't have to contend with snow tonight. So that this had been planned for a couple days before Christmas, it would be totally okay. I wouldn't be here. Well, I'm really glad to be here, just to be chatting a little bit about my book in good time. I'm going to read a little bit from it, and I always think that these events are kind of interesting because I have absolutely no idea who you are. I don't know if you know anything about my work. I don't know if you've read anything that I've written before, if you have any interest in the book in particular, or if maybe you just got dragged in by some of the marketing team as you were browsing other shelves. So I just sort of approached it like, I want to tell you about a problem that I sort of look to solve in writing this book, because I think so often my writing comes out of just my own curiosities and questions. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the learning that I did, but I'm going to leave you with a lot of suspense so that you buy the book and then, finish your learning as you read the book. And then of course we're going to take Q&A, and I'll try to offer a few funny stories, keep it lively. Time is a besetting problem for all of us, isn't it? I mean, I don't think there's probably a single person in this room who's like, I got time covered. I got plenty of time. I was actually chatting with Allie Worthington, who is the author of Breaking Busy. And I was chatting with her for her podcast, and she said, I go out and I do these events on busyness, and it's the silver-haired people who come up to me and say, busy, I'm just so busy. How do I solve the problem of busyness? And so if it's the grandmas, we're talking about busyness, then all of us are surely affected by this. I think it's really interesting to know that the problem of time anxiety, which is how I talk about it in the book, time anxiety, we did sort of discuss with my editor, does that require a hyphen or not when you make up a new word? Isn't it a hyphenated word or not? We went with no hyphen. So it's technically a phrase, not a word. But time anxiety is actually pretty old. And I read a book by David Rooney called About Time. And he just talks about the history of timekeeping. And I love this particular quote. There is the first sundial comes to Rome, ancient Rome, in 263 BCE. It's one of the first of many installed in Rome. And one Roman playwright, just talks about the angst that kind of takes over the citizens of Rome because of this sundial. The gods damn that man who first discovered the hours, and yes, who first set up a sundial here, who smashed the day into bits for poor me. When I was a boy, my stomach was the only sundial. And I just read that and thought, gosh, it was 263 BCE, and here we are still talking about the problem of time anxiety and the kind of urgency that we feel because of the clock regulating our lives. And then, of course, we think about Jesus' Sermon on the Mount a couple hundred years later, who says, which of you by being anxious could add a single hour to his span of life? And of course, hours there were measured quite differently than they are today. But it just reminds me that the problem of time anxiety is actually very old. But I think there is a way to talk about the new sort of manifestations or dimensions of time anxiety today. First of all, we can think about this whole category of productivity, which is historically recent. It really kind of grew up out of the factory to think about how can we eliminate waste and inefficiencies when we think about the output of factories. But of course, the category or sort of the measure of productivity is now for the individual worker. And if you're really interested, you could go to this article in the New York Times in August of this last year, the rise of the worker productivity score. And so it's not just Amazon workers, right, who were sort of measured by how many boxes did you pack and how many minutes did you spend off task? It's actually, there was a chaplain in this article who was assigned productivity points in Minneapolis. So you get 1 point if you visit the dying. If you participate in a funeral, you get 1 3/4 points. If you call a grieving relative, that is only worth a 1/4 point. And so you think about and I mean, that was an extreme example, but I think for all of us, it's, if we want to sort of push back on productivity and reclaim time for ourselves, we're facing these conditions that, you know, we are not in control of. Productivity is obviously this one sort of this recent manifestation of time, like that imposes, I think, time anxiety on us. The acceleration of time simply just because of technology, that we're experiencing our lives speeding up, and that's actually like real. Harmit Rosa's work is discussed in Andrew Root's book, A Congregation in a Secular Age. And he was just talking about, you know, it took 38 years for radio to reach 50 million listeners. It took 13 years for television to reach 50 million spectators. And it took 4 years for the internet to reach 50 million users. So we are experiencing just the speed, like technology speeds up our life, and that imposes another kind of anxiety upon us. This idea of like how fast can a human body move? And I think that the third point I would talk about in terms of just the conditions, sort of like the water that we're all swimming in terms of the experience subjectively of time today, is just the proliferation of choice. That you have so many choices, like we continue to grow our choices. And actually I can say that having recently moved from Toronto back to the United States, like there are so many choices in the United States. I've been away for 11 years and so I grew up in the States. I was here until I was 37, so you can do the math, I'm 48. And I remember this summer when we first, you know, we were back, all of our kids were back, and we were at a grocery store, and we see like an entire section of the grocery store dedicated to sundae toppings. Like that doesn't exist necessarily in Canada. It's just hard to get things across this like massive surface area of land. So the choices actually are far more limited when you're talking about Amazon.ca versus Amazon.com. But when you think about just the proliferation of choice, it leads you with a lot of anxiety. We know that there's a paradox involved in choice, that we think on the one hand that choice will give us more freedom, but then on the other hand, we are left feeling less satisfied with our choices because we've considered so many different options. So when you think about what it takes to kind of like filter through all the options, like that takes time. In a real sense, I think we don't have enough time. I mean, I think time scarcity today is actually an objective phenomenon, and a subjective one as well. You know, we don't have enough time in this particular hour. And I think the biblical writers would say, one way that we experience time anxiety is just that we don't have enough time in this lifetime. You know, Psalm 90 is just one of my favorite Psalms, and Moses is saying, you know, teach us to number our days that we could gain a heart of wisdom, because the span of our years, I mean, if we're lucky, we're going to get 70 years and maybe 80, but their span is going to be toil and trouble. Like this is just a very lament, like the psalm is just filled with all these discordant notes of melancholy and lament. And I think that's how we experience time as human beings. Well, of course, I was that person who felt a lot of time anxiety. I mean, I think just a brief biography, if you don't know anything about me, let's just say 5 books, 5 kids. You know, that's sort of like sums up the last 25 years of my life. And just like really feeling a lot of anxiety about getting things done, and always assuming that getting things done was a good. And so I was always reading time management books to figure out, how do I get more things done? Because of course, like that's an unquestionable good, especially if you're getting, you know, you could say getting the right things done, if you will. Was reading a lot of time management books really my entire life. I love how actually Melissa Gregg, whose work Counterproductive, like sent me on this whole different track to kind of re-examine like productivity, efficiency, what is this measuring, and is it really a good? She talks about time management as an industry and a genre that indulges, quote, the pleasure entertained in the fantasy that time can be managed. It's like, I know that pleasure. And I also know that fantasy. I read my first time management book in college, took it off my college roommate's bookshelf, never gave it back to her, and was like, this is amazing. Like, you can learn how to keep a calendar, but there's I mean, you're getting a sense of my own temperament here. And I reread that book like the next 20 years, like, or 10 years, like through college and my busy 20s, like teaching full time. And then of course, like I was a new teacher and the athletic director brings me into her office and she's like, well, you want to know how to keep a job right here? Take on coaching responsibility. So I'm coaching and then I'm also finishing graduate school in my 20s and then doing volunteer opportunities at church and then, starting a family. Like my life was always busy and I always wanted strategies. And then I got introduced to David Allen, Getting Things Done. He's like kind of a really big time management guru. I was a mom with 3 young kids and I was like, just teach me how to organize things. And just to give you a sense of like, again, this kind of idea of like time management not being like a pleasure, being a source of consolation. I'm going to read you the first 2, or actually only the first sentence to Getting Things Done. It is possible, he writes, for a person to have an overwhelming number of things to do and still function productively with a clear head and a positive sense of relaxed control. Look, okay, sign me up for that. I like clear head and a positive sense and of relaxed control. And then I kind of graduated from Allen. I mean, I was still using a lot of his strategies, but Greg McEwen is a British author who wrote a really, popular time management book called Essentialism. So it's not just about getting things done. It's really about like narrowing your priorities. And the epiphany for me in that book was his line that if you don't prioritize your life, someone else will. Like, that is very insightful. So I read all the books. I managed to get a lot of things done. And then cue the pandemic. Nobody's managing time. Time is nothing like we've never experienced time in the way that we did in the pandemic. You can't distinguish a Thursday from a Sunday from a Wednesday, you don't know, like 11 a.m. could be 4 p.m. And I think we were really left with the lament of the psalmist. How long, O Lord? Like, how long until the return to normal and the normalcy of time itself? So what do you think I did? I felt all this anxiety. Well, I just started to read I got all my time management books. I read all of the articles. Do you remember the articles early in the pandemic? Like, this is the time to get all those things done that you normally can't do because you're so busy. So clean out your garage and get your closets, all that kind of stuff. I was like, yes, I'm going to do all that. And like, I'm going to achieve what David Allen told me I could. Like, there's somehow this like relaxed, positive sense of relaxed control. And so if I do all of these things, like I'll feel in control of this global crisis. Say it now, it sounds pretty ridiculous. But I think that was really sort of what set me on the path of like, I can't solve this. Like I can't actually time is not like this problem I can hack with these strategies. And then I read Melissa Gregg. I started to just reconsider the assumptions. And I would say Melissa Gregg's work, counterproductive, was really important for me. And that's really what the book is all about. It's the journey of unlearning, because I think a lot of times when we learn, at first we have to kind of unlearn some things. And so it's like the unlearning of time management, which I came to see as pretty limited and also sometimes problematic. Because time management, if you start to sort of dig into it, you realize like it generally is the hero's journey. It's the person who performs the heroics in time because they have all of these strategies and hacks and like maybe like inner resolve, to get focused, to do the right things. Like it is often that hero's journey. And as a Christian, I don't really believe in the hero's journey. I believe there was one hero, Jesus Christ, and I am not him. So we're starting to realize like there has to be more to time than just what we save and spend and waste. And I think, looking to not just get the right things done, but one of the things that became really important as I was studying, in particular, a commentary on the Ecclesiastes, and I don't remember his name, but look in the footnotes, just talking about fitting time. So productivity tends to kind of equalize all of the minutes, all of the seconds. So long as you're like getting things done, 1 hour is always equal to another hour. It's just a measure of like how much can you get done and how much can you produce in that amount of time. Whereas fitting time started to become this really important category for me. What can only be done now? And if you didn't do it now, you might never have the opportunity again. And for me, as I was writing this book, I think very providentially, what became clear for me is that our family needed to move back from Canada, where we've been in 11 years, back to the States in order to care for my mom in a health crisis. And she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's in August. And we knew, I was writing the book knowing that something was happening, not exactly having that diagnosis, but it becoming very clear that that was what was fitting, was to actually just take on this new responsibility. And it was gonna it was gonna make our lives sort of implode or explode, I don't know, but in one direction or another, it was gonna turn them upside down, to take on this kind of new responsibility. But knowing now, having this like new category of like, no, what is fitting in the season, what can't be postponed, is to fear the Lord and honor my mom. And that, you could look at the belong chapter. I'll just quickly say that the book is structured around these 8 different habits. So time management books, I think it was in 1973, Getting Control of Your Life and Your Time, Alan Laken. He says, people as we exist in time and as we, sort of experience time anxiety, you've got 3 choices. This is what Alan says. You can drift, which means you never really decide what's important. You kind of live aimlessly. You can drown because you're just overwhelmed and with choice and opportunity, and you don't even know what to say yes to and what to say no to, or you can decide. That was kind of like always the sort of theme, I would say, of time management. Decide your life, decide what's important and go after it. And I realized there are so many more verbs than drift, drown, or decide. And so I offer you 8 in good time. I offer you the verb of begin, just to believe that in the Christian story, there's always a new beginning. And the past isn't just always going to determine your future, because God's mercies are new every day. The second habit is to receive. Don't just decide your life, receive it. Receive it as a gift. Receive your time as a gift. Belong, the third one. You don't have to live the hero's journey. You can actually rely on other people. You can be a vulnerable human being. And when you take up belonging, you take up burdens as well as blessings. And then offer your life to God as an act of worship. And then wait, because God's way with his people is often about waiting. And then practice. Don't look to get things done once and forever, once and done kind of mentality. Take up things that you're going to have to do routinely, habitually, and practice your way sometimes into faith itself. Enjoy, which is not necessarily, when time management, gurus talk about joy, it's always because you got your tickler file organized, which is probably a very old term, but when we used to have files and you could go through, I don't know, put all the things in the right order, that was just joy. Well, no, enjoying your life is receiving it from God and then coming into full encounter with the world, with God and creation and the people in your life. And then the last one really is very monastic, and it's remember that you die. The Benedictine monks in the rule of Saint Benedict, that was something that the monks would often that was in the rule. You have to rehearse and remember that you die. Teach us to number our days that we can gain a heart of wisdom. There's no way to live, our lives in time apart from recognizing that they're limited and that we need a sword of wisdom beyond ourselves. Well, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily solved all of, time management anxiety or time anxiety for me, but I can definitely say that I am a busy month. And not panicking as much as I used to, simply because I realize, these aren't things that we can control. in terms of our contingencies, the contingencies of our days and the interruptions of our days. So I do want to read the last part of the afterword just a little bit for you, and then I'm going to take questions. Someone asked me recently, I think it was must have been on the podcast, what was the biggest surprise in writing the book? And I said, well, I guess it was a surprise that as I, wrote all this, wrote the entire book basically sort of interrogating and really criticizing time management. I get to the afterword and I realized, no, but I'm probably not going to give up on reading these books. So the afterword is entitled, In Which I Don't Give Up Reading Time Management Books. Not gonna read you the whole thing, but I'll read you a little part of it. And I actually think I better put my glasses on, because speaking of time, it's creeping up on me, because I already told you I was 48. I wish I'd considered the story I was telling about time far earlier than now at midlife, although maybe there's an inevitability to that delinquency. It takes time for wisdom to grow. I fear I've been far too preoccupied with getting things done. I've hurried past people and procrastinated on important matters of discipleship. I wish someone had given me and my husband a good shake the first year of our marriage and taught us to live time fittingly. We might have continued with our graduate degrees and also have made time for more regular date nights. I wish someone had, in my dark seasons of grief, told me to slow down, to be gentle with myself, to be patient with grief, which isn't a thing to be rushed. When my children were young and running madly through the aisles of Trader Joe's, searching for the purple monkey, I wish I had believed all the dear old ladies that said, the days are long and the years are short. It's this last regret I write about in a poem to my daughter Audrey on her 16th birthday. I wish I caught those days by their tail, pinned them down for one good look. I should have squeezed tight the sight of wispy hair and stubby legs, of you not yet big and grown out of my arms. This for me might be time's greatest pain. I don't ultimately worry about failing to get things done. I'm too type A for that. I worry that time is irretrievable. I lie awake with regret, moving through memories like old slides. I am haunted by the time I've lived and can no longer affect. Regret is the thing that stabbed recently when I read the story of Joseph in Genesis. Usually when my Bible reading plan returns me to the story in the month of January, I put myself in the shoes of the younger, persecuted brother. This year, however, I was caught up in the tornado of the older brother's emotions. When they are treated roughly by Joseph upon arriving in Egypt, looking for food and accused of being spies, they know why. We are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us and we did not listen. I could see that the brothers weren't simply recalling the day's events from all those years ago. They were reliving the memory of wanting Joseph dead. They were seeing to the bottom of that hole into which they had thrown him like an animal. They were hearing his hoarse and plaintive pleas as they held his wondrous coat in their hands. I haven't committed these brothers' treachery, but I am guilty nonetheless. I could stack them up, all those wish I hads. I know what Saint Benedict would tell me to do when I am pinned down by those if onlys and what ifs. I read it in his rule. As soon as wrongful thoughts come into your heart, dash them against Christ. Benedict reminds me that I cannot rewind time by my efforts, but time will be made new through Christ's. Ultimately, I think regret, when it spirals into shame and self-condemnation, is a defeating proposition. We are not, after all, imprisoned in time, fated to keep practicing our familiar patterns of vice. Time is made new, and we are made new in it. And we don't simply breathe a sigh of relief that offense has been erased, our sin cast into the bottom of the ocean. We pledge ourselves to the lifelong process of conversion, because we are saved by mercy and for mercy's sake. That process, plodding, fitful, slow, bears the ripened fruit of wisdom. Thank you. And I think it's up to you to ask questions, I guess, and chat for a little bit. It can be anything at all. I've already told you how old I am, so. Yes.
How would you say that, like, the way you go about your days has changed since writing this book?
I think I'm more realistic. Like, we know that there's a planning bias when we plan our days. We always think that there's going to be more, we'll get more done than we actually have time for. So I think I'm far more realistic. I think I have more intentional margin in my week, I would say. I think one of the really important themes of the book is acedia. This could kind of get into the weeds a little bit, but I will say that simply that the monks thought of acedia, the sin of sloth, as actually Rebecca de Young from Calvin talks about resistance to love's demands. And I think that I could see that in my own heart, that I would be resistant to things that would take time. I didn't want, so all I've done over the last 6 months is like take on burdens that take a lot of time to care for somebody who can't care for themselves, you know. So a lot of it was like untangling financial stuff and calling insurance companies and visiting communities, you know, for my mom's living. I mean, just all the things. And whereas I used to feel that that was an imposition on my day, now I'm just like, of course, you know, like, of course, I mean, I'm human. So if you do hear me talking to the customer service rep at the dental insurance company, like if there's a recording that gets aired, you know, from the call last week, it was like, why are we still talking about this last summer? You know, trying to untangle this very thing, you know, but I would say overall, I realize I'm more radically accepting of the nature of human life. And what it means to be in community with other people, to care for them, just like these things are going to take time. And so waiting and, you know, inefficiency, like this is just a part of it. And I do think that's true for me, that's changed for me. Question? Yes.
Just thinking about like January is the time where you're seeing all these blog posts on like organizing your year and getting the most out of like whatever. You know, I'm just kind of curious, like as you've gone through this process of like thinking about and writing this, like what narratives kind of stick out to what we're being told, and like how do these things hit you now, having gone through the journey of, you know, the research and writing for this book?
Number one, I would say they often appeal to our sense of control. That so often, like kind of language around like New Year's resolution, like change your life and you're in control of it. And I think it's so paradoxical. You know, like it really is. Like on the one hand, I think to be human and to have the capacity to choose and decide is an incredible honor and dignity that God has given to us as his creatures. You know, Dante says it's the highest gift that's given to human beings, the freedom to choose. And I'm not going to get in the weeds on like how all that works in the mechanics of like God's universe, grace and free will. But this idea of deciding is important, but controlling. But so like the appeal to control sometimes touches on like an inner human desire to be responsible in the world, which I think is beautiful. But our responsibility, like it can't be control. And so resolutions and goals are so often like these finish line things that like you don't know for example, I am in a group at my church and it is resolution based. And so I'm not going to do resolutions. I'm gonna do my rule of life. Are you guys okay about that? And we'll get back. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. One of the women this last week said, well, last year, one of his goals was to swim the English Channel. And she was like, I thought that something that I'm sure that's gonna work with our family. You know? So these resolutions and goals are kind of made in the most idealistic kind of way. Like, sure, if you have a perfect year, but like, well, God forbid you get sick, or you have an unexpected grief, or something just goes awry in your life some way. So I find the rule of life practice to be far more fruitful and I think more human. And when I talk about that, it's really just a Benedictine practice of thinking about accepting the givens of your life, naming the desires you have for transformation, and then formulating those as just regular goals and practices. So for example, you know, I don't have a resolution to become an amazing daughter this year, but I do have in my rule of life articulated, I will try to see my mom 3 times a week. I will weekly, I don't know if I have weekly on there, actually I have it in here. I will regularly, you know, look at her finances, and I can 100% tell you that I am not doing that, you know, because I just felt like, oh no, what's gonna happen? I open Chase. But so that idea of like habits and practices are important for transformation. And I think that is a biblical category. And I think we know even neurologically that it's far more, that it is a means to transformation and change. And if we're gonna use the word control, I'm gonna just say that you could be more in control of your habits and practices than you are of your finish lines. And so that's what I think is more fruitful. So I would say, what's happening, like always be aware when people are appealing to your sense of control. Like, wait, hold on, like, do I have control? And is that something that I want to be doing as a Christian? Like, do I really believe in that? And then I would also say just joy. I mean, I sort of read it. This whole idea of like, it's always selling you on the promise of like greater peace, greater joy. It's not just control for control's sake. It's control so that you can feel more peaceful, have more joy, have more margin maybe too, you know, so that you can do the fun things on your bucket list. It's always the half-truths in life that really are the ones that are the most dangerous, I find. And so again, deciding is good, agency is good, intentionality is good. But insofar as it kind of, you know, nosedives into control, then you're in deep waters.
You have a big resource for developing a rule of life.
I'm offering a workshop right now, but which is now currently closed. But I think it's doing a lot of really business elimination of Hurry I have not read, and I don't know how much he talks about it there, but I also know that he has a podcast now on the rule of life. Tish Harrison Warren, her opinion column this last week was on a rule of life. So Ruth Haley Barton talks about it in some of her books. What I have found, and then of course you can go to this rule of St. Benedict and just kind of like really, I mean, and then all the people who write about St. Benedict, Esther DeWall has some really interesting books. That's kind of how I started actually in the pandemic. It was just like, maybe the nuns have something to teach us. You know, once I was like, my time management is not solving my problem. Who should I go to next? The monks and the nuns. The cloistered human experience. So you can follow people who write a lot about St. Benedict. You're going to find some there. Dennis Ockholm has a book, Living Like a Monk, or Monk Habits for Everyday People, I think is what it's called. I'm not sure if he talks about a rule of life, but it's those kinds of people who are dealing with monastic tradition and wisdom who are often trying to translate it for the contemporary audience. But we do need more resources, I think, you know, so we can get a whole like book on a rule of life. I don't know that will be my next book, but I do think I will offer this workshop again. So, you know, you can sign up for my newsletter and learn more, you know, if I offer it, I'll tell people about it there. Yes.
So a lot of the stuff I've read on rule of life and on time often starts and stops in Sabbath.
Mm.
But it seems like you're talking more about the rest of the week
Yeah,
as you're talking about time. So I'm wondering if you could just share a little bit the relationship between Sabbath practices as you've encountered them with the work you're doing on.
yeah. Well, I would say that it could seem very short-sighted that I don't have a chapter dedicated to Sabbath. Part of that was because I already did a chapter on Sabbath and keeping place, so it was like, well, there's sort of a lot about Sabbath there. But I do make the point in Receive that when, and I got this from AJ Swoboda, Subversive Sabbath, where he talks about, you know, the first, like basically the first gift to human beings was rest. You know, it's like the seventh day, and God's like, so guys, the first thing on the agenda is rest. You know, Sabbath, enjoy, delight in this world that I've made for you. So I think the Sabbath practice is critical to a rule of life because Sabbath reorients so many things. It reorients our relationship to work. You know, it really, this is the language that I often use is that Sabbath restories us. And so there are two stories for ancient Jewish people. You know, when the Sabbath command is given in Exodus and Deuteronomy, it's linked with number one in Deuteronomy. In Exodus, God made the world in 6 days, rested on the seventh day. You're made in his image. You're made in the image of a working, resting God. Keep the Sabbath. And then in Deuteronomy, it's you know, I delivered you out of Egypt, you know, when I gave you the Sabbath. And you know, this is the way that you are, I recognize I'm giving you humanity. You're humanity back. So I think Sabbath is critical, but I think a rule of life does expand beyond that because it thinks about rhythms of in time that are not just daily or weekly, but I would say monthly, seasonally, yearly, you know, and the Christian calendar is a way that we can engage those kinds of rhythms. But I think of a rule of life as a way for people to really attend their own roles and responsibilities and formulate what faithfulness would look like in their own particular life. So the way that I've come to define it, and this is not the official definition because lots of people have different definitions, but I talk about it as a practice of patterning our lives, that's the rhythm kind of nature of it, patterning our lives in faithful response to God's voice. And I love how response really kind of channels that word responsibility. So there is a way we're taking up responsibilities in the world, but in response to God's voice. So that's a good question. Yes, go ahead.
So I would imagine that you spent a lot of time in all sorts of different resources and books about this topic. Is there anything now that the book is out that you're kind of turning your attention to exploring a little bit more as a focus?
I mean, I have been doing a lot of work on the rule of life, like which I had already done a lot of reading on, but it's kind of my own work on like, how do I help people through this as a practice? Because I find it to be really critical today to navigate the choices, you know, articulate kind of intentional things that are formulated as habits and practices. So I am doing a lot of work on that. I will say that I just finished, we already talked about it at dinner, Dante's Divine Comedy. And I'm reading that for my MFA. So that is just the work I'm doing right now is I'm really trying to cultivate my vocation as a writer and believing that this is what God has called me to do, which is, and I just can't, I'm not everything, you know, I think I'm a speaker too, and, you know, I do teach Bible studies and that kind of stuff, but I think primarily I really do feel called to be a writer, which is why I started the MFA. And so I just finished Dante, and it's incredible. I think that somewhere out there must be a dissertation on time in Dante, like many. But it's very interesting because Dante was written right at the beginning of the 14th century, which is when clocks were really starting to come into the Benedictine monasteries. There's a lot of reference to time in Dante. One of the things that's really beautiful, I have to say, in Purgatorio, which is like the middle canticle, it's always like, people are going through their process of purgation, they're purging their sins, they're being cleansed from their sins, and then they're going to paradise. But that process has to be complete. And so it's always like in purgatory, is that don't wait, don't like take haste, be not like hurry, but like don't waste time, like get through this process because you're going to God. And I think there's just a lot of really beautiful things like that. There's a lot in Dante about the paradox of human agency and divine grace and how these things work together. So this has nothing to do with things that I'm writing, although I have mentioned it in my newsletter, and I have some people like, tell us more about Dante. So there will be a letter coming out soon about Dante. But I don't have another book project that I'm contracted for. I think it's really a period of discernment for me. Yes.
I just have to ask, how do you manage your time for writing a book? Do you set a work schedule for yourself, or are you a procrastinator and write it all last minute, or do you take notes as you go? Like, how do you do yours?
That's a great question. I'm generally not a procrastinator. So I pretty much like kind of plod along. I will tell you that this particular book was written under duress. And I think it was great to live it in a season of life that just my life was like kind of turning over upside down, realizing that my mom was not well, deciding that we were going to move back to the States. And so that required like multiple visits and then all kinds of different things. Like whenever you're thinking about moving to a new country and just, moving back and selling a house and buying a house and just all the like admin stuff of moving. And then I also tell the story about a friend who has metastatic breast cancer, and how I leave like probably a month before my deadline to be with her for 11 days. And so there was a lot of trusting. I did not meet my deadline. I will tell you that. It is the first deadline that I have missed. And my editor knew I turned in part of it when it was due and part of it later. But generally, I just treat writing like it's just a regular job. And even before my mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, she would always call me. So it was like, 9:30 or 10:15 in the morning. She's like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm working. Just like, I know it's not to an office, but it is what I do. So I try to just treat the day like a regular work day. And I probably make more trips to the refrigerator since it's my own house than I would if I were at a regular office, but that's pretty much how I get it done. Okay, well, we'll let Becky come up and I'll look forward to chatting with you guys a little bit more maybe at the table.